All right guys, project of the day, we're going to build a better tapering jig for your Fusion table saw. Stick around, we'll get into the details. Okay, so far we've made up the base for the tapering jig, which includes a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that we've done cross-grain dados to receive the T-tracks. We made 4 slots for the T-tracks, and then on the back side we've got the hardwood runner installed, and the edge has been trimmed flush with the saw. One cool thing about this sort of jig is that you can use it from the left or the right edge. So if you're running 2 table saws in your shop, it's not a problem. Everything is reversible. You can have one edge for one saw and the other edge for the second saw. What are you doing, silly? I think we'll use some walnut to make the fence for this tapering jig. So we'll head over to the router table next and make the slots for the fence. All right, to make the slots to accept the hardware for our jig rail, we're going to start with this 1/2 inch straight bit. That'll mill just a shallow groove similar to this to accept the head of the T-bolt. This trial run in a 5/8 inch bit was a little bit too wide, so we're just going to do a 1/2 inch straight bit and widen the slot with a second pass if needed. And then for the through groove, we're going to switch to this 5/16 wide spiral bit to complete the cut. The first pass with the 1/2 inch bit is just a little bit too snug for the head of this 5/16 T-bolt, so we'll flip the board around and make a second pass. I set the fence up according to a sample cut so that one cut from either side would make a perfect groove for this T-bolt. Okay, looks like that'll be a perfect fit for our 5/16 T-bolt. And now with the 5/16 spiral bit, we'll cut that in 2 depth settings. Alright, well, we epoxied in some T-track into the main base of our sled overnight and clamped those in, as well as the short length screws. So that to me is really the key to making T-track work anytime you're using 3/4 inch stock. Remember, you only have 3/8 of an inch for the depth of the screw to penetrate into below the T-track. It's really not going to give you much strength as far as hold down power once you go and start clamping something in place to use on your sled. But if you epoxy those in plus the screws, I think that gives ample strength for a project like this. So we'll pull these clamps off and see how we did. On the back side now we have our hardwood runner that's been sized to our Fusion F2 table saw, and that's operating nice and smoothly. So we can just go ahead and take a T-bolt and put it in the T-track, and we can use this fence that we've made. Now we kind of laid out the spots for our slots here to run across areas where there would be T-tracks available. So we have the T-bolt option to use to mount this fence to set up for the tapering cuts. But since the bottom is also recessed with an offset slot, a double slot there, we can actually use that for toggle clamps as well. So it gives us kind of a multi-function fence. if you are going to let the toggle clamps cantilever out over the fence, you want to make sure that you have at least 3 inches of clearance so the blade never has the opportunity to hit the metal hardware. Looks like that's got pretty good holding power there. Now when you're ready to put your jig into use, go ahead and take a little paste wax and wax up that hardwood runner. Some people put paste wax all over the bottom of the jig. That's fine. I don't think you need to go crazy with it, but particularly hit the sides of that hardwood runner on the bottom of the jig. Well, with the slots made up and the toggle clamps all mounted to the fence, we're ready to attach that to the jig. And the main attachment point is just by these 5/16 T-bolts. So those ride in the T-track. Makes it real simple to install. Just fish those bolts through the slots and we'll start installing the hardware that locks this fence in place. One thing I'd say about the knobs is you do want to spring for good quality knobs for all your jigs and fixtures in the shop. These are 5-star rubber overmolded knobs. You can find those at Rockler. Another good option is these woodpecker knobs where you actually supply your own nut. You can make them work with 1/4 inch or 5/16 is what we're using in this case, but they're a nice heavy duty plastic knob. They work well. What I wouldn't recommend is kind of the hardware store variety. These thin, cheaply made, although they're tool free and they're not terribly uncomfortable on the hands, they're just not built very well. They can crack out and the fastener can pull out in regular use. So do yourself a favor right from the get-go, skip the cheap knobs and buy good quality hardware to make jigs that'll last. The cool thing is this whole assembly is reversible. Let's say you were running 2 table saws in a larger shop. You could actually trim this so that one edge corresponded with the blade on one table saw and the opposite edge corresponds with the blade on the second saw. Even though these clamps only face one direction, this whole thing is removable. You can spin it around the other way and make use of this great jig on 2 different saws. Because we milled that groove in the underside of this walnut fence, you can also make use of any accessory that you can mount with a 5/16 inch T-bolt. Just remove the fence temporarily, add any additional clamps or accessories you want, and tighten them down with a knob. It's a great system. Well, there's lots of versions of these tapering jigs. This is the one I've been using for about the last 10 years. It's nothing fancy. It's a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. It does have a runner on the bottom, just like the one we're building today. And I think that's an important distinction because some people actually run their jig up against the fence of the table saw. To do that, you really need a feather board, and the problem I've noticed is some feather boards are actually thicker than 3/4 of an inch. Because of that, the feather board actually gets in the way of using the jig that way. So I really recommend making the sort of jig that has a runner on the bottom. Now, I don't necessarily think you need to go with steel or aluminum runners in this case. A hardwood runner will work just fine. What I noticed in using this jig over the years, although I did put a couple T-tracks in here, there aren't enough of them. So when you build your jig, make sure to make enough cross-grain grooves so you can mount a bunch of these T-tracks for more versatility when it comes to clamping your workpiece. In practice, what I did with this jig is really just screw these clamp blocks down and secure the workpiece with toggle clamps. That worked pretty well too, although you do have to remount and physically screw into your jig each time you do a new workpiece cut. That was okay, but I was probably long overdue to replace this jig. You can set up your jig so that it rips from the left or the right of the blade. I've got mine to go on this miter slot to my left of the blade. And the first thing you want to do is just make sure that you don't have any extra friction when you slide the sled across your table saw and into that miter groove. And now we put a little paste wax on that runner and that really freed things up. This has got a good sliding action. I think we're ready to make some test cuts. As we get down here closer to the taper, this one's going to be too far and will intersect the blade, so we'll leave that one retracted. But this one will be just fine, so we'll be able to use almost all of the clamps for this first cut. Now, just think of all the applications this jig could have in the workshop. Let's say you had to make a back leg for a bar stool. It's got an angle to it, but it needs to have a flat face. You could put this against the fence, tighten that up, and go ahead and make a nice, clean face cut that would be great to reference the joinery. What about two-sided tapers on white oak legs for arts and crafts furniture? No problem with this tapering sled. Now, if you notice, I referenced my leg workpiece at the same length as my walnut fence here. So when I go to flip the workpiece for that second taper, I know exactly where to put it for a matching cut. We'll unclamp after that second cut and see how we did. There we go. Perfect low tapered leg for your arts and crafts nightstand or coffee table. Or what about an awkward plywood cut that you just can't quite make at the miter saw? Here's one situation where this long bent clamp, because it's tied in the T-track, can't quite make the reach to help out with this clamping. What we'll do instead, I'll release it from the T-track and we'll install the T-bolt in this groove that we've milled in our walnut fence, and I bet we can make that reach to help clamp this board down for this tapered cut. Now that we're free from the T-track, this bent clamp is free to move anywhere along that groove. So we'll go ahead and make use of that and add a little extra clamping pressure there. And finally, here's an example of how to use the jig to establish a straight edge on rough sawn lumber. Well, if you haven't added a joiner to your power tool collection, then handling live edge slabs like this may be a real challenge for you in your shop. But with this tapering sled, we found that it's really easy to trim the edge, even if it's got a live bark edge. No problem with this jig. But if you are considering a joiner purchase in the near future, look at the JX8, particularly the one with the ShearTech 2 head. Alright guys, that'll about do it on the better tapering sled for your Fusion table saw. Remember to check the description box for the link on that blog. More details there on this build. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. What are you doing? What are you doing? High five.